Hello, nonprofit leaders. I'm Sarah Olivieri, your host, and this podcast is here to assist people like you, executive directors, board members, and other nonprofit leaders make a bigger impact with insights, tips, and lessons learned from nonprofit leaders and experts. Having been an executive director, a board member, and now a consultant and coach, I truly understand the challenges you face. And that's why I'm here. I'm all about working smarter, not harder, so you can make a bigger impact without the burnout. And so is our sponsor, DonorBox. DonorBox isn't just a suite of helpful fundraising tools, it's a partner that helps you raise more money and supports you in retaining your donors. I love their forward-thinking approach. Visit donorbox.org to learn more. And don't forget to sign up for the Inspired Nonprofit Leadership newsletter, where you'll get bite-sized, actionable tips just for nonprofit leaders like you, delivered weekly to your inbox. Sign up at inspirednonprofitleadership.com/sign up. Okay, let's dive into today's episode. Today, I have a special guest, Leah Kral, who is the author of Innovation for Social Change: How Wildly Successful Nonprofits Inspire and Deliver Results. She is an expert facilitator and author who helps social entrepreneurs innovate and further social change, which she writes about in her book. We're going to talk about those things today. She is also a sought-after speaker at nonprofit industry events and writes frequently about her research, and for decades has provided tailored consulting to nonprofit teams and coaching to social entrepreneurs across the country. She's the principal and owner at Two Larks Consulting, and she has a passion for helping organizations achieve their missions. Welcome, Leah. It's such a pleasure to have you. Before we dive into things nonprofit leadership and strategy and innovation, would you tell us something about yourself personally?
Oh, wow. Well, it's an honor to be here. And I mean, I'm a nonprofit nerd and a nerd in other ways in life. I spend most of my free time like reading or watching documentaries or, going out into nature and just enjoying quiet time. But I live just outside of Washington, D.C., and I've been working with nonprofits for the last 20 years. So a huge fan of the podcast. So I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. Well, welcome. Well, let's start with your book. For those who haven't read it, what inspired you? What is it about, just super high level, and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah, so the book is about how to be an innovative and effective nonprofit, and it's really written for busy nonprofit practitioners. It's very accessible and full of stories, and it really came out of my working with nonprofits over the last 20 years. And, I've spent a lot of time working with nonprofit teams on, just how to break through the status quo, or how to do creative thinking, how to use tools like design thinking, or how to think through your theory of change, and I just really enjoy that work. Over the years, I just kind of threw myself into it and got really creative with my webinars. I might incorporate Lord of the Rings or Minions, and it just became so much fun to me, and it turned into a book.
Yeah. So let me ask you, and I'd speak, I've read the majority of this book, and I think it is full of great stories and also really like practical, like do this kind of workshop with your team, like step 1, step 2, step 3. So it's super, super accessible. And I really like that about it. I want to ask you about, why is innovation important in the nonprofit space?
Yeah. So when I knew I wanted to write a book, and I just started thinking of putting a book together in terms of nonprofit effectiveness, because that's kind of what I do day in and day out. But as I started interviewing folks and the stories started taking shape, I realized I really wanted to write about innovation. And I think it's a little counterintuitive, because when most people hear that word, they automatically think of the business world or a tech or something they love, like an iPad, right? And as I've been out talking about the book and interacting with folks, I'll hear these amazing, super innovators in the impact space, social impact space, who don't see themselves that way. But I think of innovation simply as just finding new and better ways of doing things. And we have people in our sector doing that all the time, whether they see themselves that way or not. And it can be big or it can be small. I think of, big innovations in our sector, something like the American Civil Rights Movement or the creation of the 911 emergency system. But, small innovations are important too. And it could be as simple as, someone at a legal aid clinic at the reception desk coming up with an idea of, instead of paper-based intake forms that take lots of time and have to be entered somewhere, why not try, just entering right into an iPad and saving steps and time that can now be applied, elsewhere in the organization. That's innovation too. We want that. So my book is all about how do we make that happen in the nonprofit workplace.
Yeah, I love that you started with effectiveness, because that's how I think of my work, but I see them to be effective as a nonprofit. For the majority of nonprofits, you have to be able to innovate. My kind of like big mission in this world in the nonprofit space is, I see the nonprofits are solving our world's most complex, unsolved problems. And how can you solve those if you aren't amazing at innovation? And like, I probably will never see this in my lifetime, but I'll be very happy if I see, when we think who's the best industry at innovating, instead of thinking about like Google and Silicon Valley, that we think about the nonprofit industry. So just a big celebration for you putting that out there.
And I like how you framed that too. And if we start with whatever the social problem is, it may take all three sectors coming together. Like if it's overfishing, we're going to need the civil society sector with nonprofits, government, and the business sector coming together, to be innovative and break through those really complex, social problems. So, yes.
Yeah. So in your book, you talk about 6 principles for social change innovation. I'd love it if you'd kind of take us through those to give people a sense of what they are.
Yes.
And maybe if you can add in, if you have any, like, as you did your research, like, what surprised you or what has surprised your clients as you've applied these principles to them, as like, oh, aha moment.
I love that. Yes, it wasn't until I got to almost the very end of the book that I was like, well, I need to summarize this in sort of a punchy way. And then I went back through it and realized, oh yeah, I can kind of summarize this in 6 principles. So those are: number 1, like a detective, be a fearless problem solver, because it's all about uncovering hidden needs. And sometimes, those just aren't handed to us with a bow, right? I think of that saying, was it by Henry Ford, that if I would have asked my customers what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse, and it's the same for us. Like, the folks we're serving so I've got, chapters and stories on what that looks like in practice and uncovering those hidden needs. Fun stories, almost like Undercover Boss. The second is be courageous.
I did that once for a client.
Oh, did you?
When I was doing mostly marketing for nonprofits, they were a mental health organization, and we have a local like United Way, like was it 411? I hope I don't.
Oh, maybe 211.
211. Yes, thank you. Like that doesn't sound right. And I was like, we're gonna do secret fire, and I went in and I called 211. I had like a whole persona of this client. And boy, did it reveal a lot of terrible things.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I think that's strategic and smart, and we're wise to do things like that. So that's
and it was fun. It was fun too.
And I'm sure it sparks so much learning and innovation. The second is be courageous with your ideas. We could start small but dream big. So even if there's some really big, complex social problem that we want to solve, we can, be courageous about how you want to go about it, but then we're going to have to break it into steps. The third is that when people on the front lines are empowered to speak up and collaborate, breakthroughs will happen. And I've got stories in my book from organizations like Mayo Clinic, one of the most innovative nonprofit hospitals in the world. And the things they do, you don't have to have a huge budget. A lot of these things are workplace culture things that any nonprofit can do. The fourth is to leave room for experiments, play, risk-taking, and even that big scary word, failure, because, trial and error, failure, it just comes with the territory with innovation, and that's okay. But often leadership, has to set that from the top, from the board and executive director. And I've got stories, a whole chapter on nonprofit experimentation that I think are really helpful. And, people just they hear experiments and they think, oh, science lab, right? But you think of a nonprofit itself is a hypothesis, right? Our theory of change is kind of if we do this, then we think that will happen. So just by default, we're kind of, we're experimenting. So that comes with the territory. We just may not think of it that way. The fifth is to embrace continuous learning by asking ourselves really hard questions. One of my clients has this saying that we ask ourselves the hard questions so our board and donors don't have to. I love that. And that really helps create an entrepreneurial problem-solving culture. And the sixth, I'm sorry.
Before we move on, like, so many people are, afraid, like, what if your board, asks you the hard question or your donor asks you, but if you asked it preemptively, you're no longer afraid because you now have the answer, or you're confident in knowing that the answer is not easily knowable. And I think your stakeholders respond strongly to you asking hard questions. I know, even just to give like a personal example, I knew I'd kind of had a breakthrough in my own professional development when I went from trying to help find the answer always to being able to comfortably sit back and say, that is a really hard problem. I have no idea what the answer is, but I have a few processes that seem to work almost every time, and I'm confident we can go through the process and that an answer will emerge. And just being being comfortable with the complexity and the not knowing is something that you get from asking hard
100%.
questions.
Yes, I love how you stated that. And yeah, risk is part of that. And that can be some of the most strategic thinking a nonprofit team does, is just surfacing and naming those risks and saying, we don't have the answer, but these are things we are aware of and we're going to monitor for and try to come up with creative solutions and ask others for advice. And then the sixth of the six practices would be persuasion. We have to be really good at this. And I think most people think of, well, yeah, we've got to fundraise. We have to persuade donors. But in the nonprofit sector, we're persuading not just, our donors, but all sorts of folks, whether it's we're trying to persuade superstar talent to come work at our nonprofit, or if you're at a larger nonprofit, like I've worked at, maybe you're trying to persuade the team down the hall to support your project, right? And
right.
I think it was Desmond Tutu who said, don't raise your voice, improve your arguments. And so I have a lot in my book about uncomfortable conversations and how to be persuasive. It's so important.
It is, I used to do marketing for nonprofits, and, as I did the secret buyer. But another thing I worked with a lot of nonprofits who were like mental health organizations or dealt with homelessness or addiction. And I was often saying, like, hey, when we're dealing with addiction from a marketing perspective, trying to get somebody to get help, like, literally, like, our competition is heroin. Like, our competition are highly addictive drugs, right? That is like the toughest competition. You need the absolute best marketing and persuasion, right? Nothing subpar is going to do it in order to kind of win that battle of getting people to come get help. And I was always such a huge advocate of, like, people who don't have a lot of money, they still don't want crappy mental health services. They want something good. You've got to present yourself as worth the investment and the risk and the fear that they have to push through to even accept help and whatever it takes to get there, because so often access is a challenge. So that's so, so important. I'm wondering, do you have, in these kind of 6 principles domains, a favorite area to work on, or a few that like pack the biggest punch?
One of the examples that just sticks in my mind so much. So the middle part of the book gets at organizational design. So while the first part of the book is all about design thinking, it's a lot of fun. Like, people really enjoy that first part because thought exercises and sparking creativity. So the middle part of the book is all about organizational design. And if you're kind of a systems nerd like me, you'll love that. So when if the question is, how do we create systems and processes in our workplace so that innovation is just normal and encouraged and part of our everyday, workplace? So one of the stories I love comes from Mayo Clinic, and it was their night staff. So if you think about, if you're, someone who's very sick, then a good night's sleep is so important to the healing process. And the way Mayo Clinic works is their staff is empowered to live out their values, their organizational values. I think one of them is the needs of the patient come first, and another is unsurpassed collaboration. And they practice what they preach. These are not just platitudes on a wall. These are built into training, and they're incentivized and encouraged. to do this. So the Mayo Clinic night staff was worried about patients getting a good night's sleep. And so they came together and started brainstorming, and they're like, let's conduct some noise studies. And so they did. And as a result of those noise studies, some solutions that came out of that were quieter wheels on food carts, lower decibels for overhead paging, things like that. Very actionable solutions. And to me, that's the beauty of, if you design systems and incentives and, if your workplace is kind of set up in the right way, then the frontline staff are going to be empowered to speak up. And, it's not necessarily the executive director who's going to come up with the best ideas, right? It's the frontline staff. So that story just really sticks with me because it's not expensive, right? I mean, this is something that, any of us can implement. Really great practices.
Yeah, that one story really speaks to me, particularly because when I had my son, who's now 12, I spent almost a month on bed rest in the hospital.
Oh, wow.
And I will never forget. I spent like the first 2 days in intensive care version. And then I was like a long-term stay. So they moved me over. And I will never forget the first night in like the long-term stay section. A nurse comes in and says, "Are you planning to sleep tonight?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm about to be here for weeks. Of course I'm planning to sleep." And then I personally had to negotiate. They had this policy that if you're still pregnant, they take your temperature and your vitals every 3 hours. Wow. And I had to build a relationship with every overnight nurse and convince them that they, in fact, were going to skip one of those, because they were going to let me be undisturbed for 6 hours in the middle of the night and that I would be fine. But that is such a, reasonable, I was a stable patient, right? But otherwise, if I didn't have those self-advocacy skills, and here's a simple systemic thing, let's not wake up sleeping patients in the middle of the night as a matter of routine. Maybe that defeats the purpose of bed rest slightly. So yeah, these things can be simple. Can you talk a little more about how do we build that culture? I really love your chapter on measurement and effective evaluation. And I think that ties into this systemic approach of innovation. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about making measurement good.
Yeah. I remember last year I was giving a talk at a conference about measurement and evaluation, and some of the people in the audience I knew well, and one of the audience members raised his hand and said, "Leah, with all due respect, measurement kills my soul." And, he's as a friend, and he meant it, with a sense of humor. But he's right. I think a lot of times we can really approach measurement and evaluation in a way that squashes innovation. And so I have a chapter in my book on that. And the way I started the chapter is all the ways we can do measurement wrong. And I cited a book that's just great on this. It's called The Tyranny of Metrics. Mm-hmm. And it's about a 4-hour read. It's really creative. He uses HBO's The Wire, in stories of measurement in that HBO series from the school system or the police system, just to illustrate in a fun sort of way, don't do these things. So I agree with him. We can measure the wrong thing. We can incentivize the wrong thing. We can, focus on short-term over long-termism, things like that. And so I start my chapter that way. But then what should metrics do for us? And to me, it's all about answering the question, how do we know if what we're doing is working? And then just being kind of pragmatic about it, And so I really like empowering, as much as we can, empower the frontline staff, the ones with their sleeves rolled up and doing the work. Let them propose the metrics. How would they answer the question? How do we know if what we're doing is working? There could be so much, pain from when metrics are imposed from afar, maybe from a grant-making foundation, when I would far rather see it proposed from the organization and negotiated, right? It can be a negotiation if the foundations want to feel like there's accountability and that they're meaningful. But yes, and I've got stories in that chapter of it being done really well. One from a foster nonprofit in Austin, Texas that works with young people in foster care. They had a great story of how they really turned things around by asking those questions. I thought it was a great story. Or from charter schools, so I'm really proud of having so many, practical real world examples in the book that illustrate. So it's not just abstract talk, right? These are things that are done in the real world that we can learn from.
Yeah, I think that, I really like that about the book. And I think, the point you just made about the metrics should answer that question of like, how do we know if it's working? And so often I see organizations mostly just measuring like how many people they served, but that doesn't, that doesn't tell you much unless you know how well your programs are getting outcomes for those people.
Yes.
Um, and I think too, there is that pressure, and even in like measuring money, which is easy to measure compared to all the other things, I find myself often telling nonprofit leaders, like, you make the financial plan, whether you call it a budget or not, first and foremost, that tells you what you need to know, that helps you make better financial decisions. The IRS can have their version, and your grantors, get your bookkeeper and accountant to make whatever version they want. But don't just accept their model and then have it be like this meaningless document to you. You need, and I feel like, you kind of touched on this, but like great measurement makes you excited.
Yes.
You look at the number, and I often tell my clients, like, if you look at that number and you're like, or it doesn't motivate you, or it doesn't like evoke an emotion, that's probably not a good, like, to get rid of that metric and replace them until you're like, oh, I'm excited to look at this number, right? This says something to me. Like, I can translate this into something meaningful.
Yes. And related, kind of as you're saying there, that the nonprofit budgeting process can be really tied to exciting strategic thinking. And I've seen a nonprofit where their regular budgeting process was whatever the time interval is, that's right, whether it's every 6 months or annually, the budget manager would answer 3 questions. What would I do with the same amount? What would I do with 20% more? What would I do with 20% less? And that just those questions force trade-off thinking, really creative thinking, and asking yourselves those hard questions. So I agree 100%.
I love that example. And there's so many good, what I call them like strategic questions that get you to think creatively in the book. I haven't heard those ones before for the budget, and I love that, but they remind me of one of my favorites is like, if you were to have to start over again tomorrow, what would you do? Because that can, it can get you to like let go of all the legacy things, right? Because our brains are biased to hold on to legacy stuff. I forget what that bias is called. But anyway, we hold on to those things.
Definitely.
Before we come to wrap up time, you talk about building innovation into an organization's DNA. And I think part of that is about, building a team or designing your team so that they're a team of high performers. That's how I would phrase it. I don't think that's how you phrase it. But could you talk a little bit about, really making this part of the everyday?
Yeah. So that's kind of the middle part of my book. And, I broke it down. There's probably like 4 or 5 chapters in there on that and on different things, whether it's workplace culture and very practical things we can do, like the interview process. So I've seen really successful nonprofits hire for values over specific skills. Even Mayo Clinic does that. And you think of something as technical as a doctor, they're looking for values more than anything. Because if you think about how that ties into your culture, like healthy collaboration or emotional maturity or, the ability to have uncomfortable conversations rather than creating a toxic environment. That's so important, right? So you can build that into your recruiting process, your interview question. You can ask things like, tell me about a time where you challenged the status quo or you disagreed with your boss. How did it work out? And you're kind of watching to see, like, is the candidate just throwing someone under the bus or did they take ownership, right? And get a sense of their values and what they've done. So I think that's so important. You can build things into your performance review process like that. I love 360 reviews where you're reviewed by your peers, not just your immediate boss. And maybe your peers are asked questions like that. Tell me about a time where Leah challenged the status quo and how did that work out? Or have did you see Leah, involved in any uncomfortable conversations to make something better? And how did that work out, right? So those are just kind of simple things. And so that middle section of the book is really just full of practical, things that you could build into your structure that aren't expensive, that anyone could do.
Yeah. I was asking about that partly because so many conversations I have about nonprofit effectiveness come down to so many nonprofits. How should I say this? They had a scarcity mindset. And so they hired a team of people who were whoever would do the job for the little money that they were offering. And I think then systemically, we have many nonprofits who don't have enough leadership in place. They don't have enough people who are kind of high performing, great strategic thinkers. Some of that I think is because some of the basic pay disparities, but I think it can be hard. And I'm just wondering if you've seen that, because I feel like I've gone into a lot of nonprofits where I'm like, whoa, like we need to like staff up leadership like big time. There's gaps all over the place. And sometimes there's huge amounts of staff turnover that need to happen to get to that place. So I'm curious what your experience has been.
The way I've kind of approached, no doubt about it, like nonprofits struggle with resources. And so I've always, in my consulting work, I've kind of approached it from maybe an abundance mindset of what can we do with what we have. And I like to ask staff that I'm working with, you have passion, you care about our mission. So what gets in the way? Like when you have a good idea, what you tell me, like what gets in the way? Just be honest, tell me. And so I ask that most often when I'm giving book talks, and I'll hear things like, there's all sorts of things that get in the way. Resources would be one, but it could be maybe you don't feel like you have permission to speak up, or you feel like you have to stay in your own lane, or things like that, or what I'll call kind of the tyranny of the urgent, just busyness, and we're not making time to be strategic, or the fog of good intentions. We have plenty of passion, we care, but are we really clear, on what problem we're trying to solve? So that's kind of how I come at that, from a kind of a form of empowerment and helping teams ideate, no matter what their resource situation is. And I feel really encouraged. I did a ton of research. As I mentioned, I love reading. That's what I'm doing on the weekends. I'm reading biographies and stories, which is fed right into the book. So stories from nonprofit powerhouses we've all heard of, like, Mayo Clinic, Alcoholics Anonymous, Fred Rogers, the Civil Rights Movement, Habitat for Humanity, all started super small with no resources, just maybe somebody with an idea and a few volunteers who cared. And, it took years, to build those organizations up and for those organizations to find the right way, to solve problems. But they did. So to me, that's really encouraging. Like, lack of resources doesn't necessarily have to be a deal breaker. And there's so many, silos can be a part of that problem, right? Just trying to solve a massive problem by ourselves, when maybe partnerships or being part of a collaboration or ecosystem, then each of us bring our tiny resources into a bigger pot. So there's so many ways to think about that. I love that question.
Yeah, I love that you shared that about resources. It makes me think of the story of Scott and Amundsen, who were on a race to, one was Robert Scott was from Britain, and Amundsen, I forget his first name, was from Norway. And they were scientists on a race to see the first person to reach the South Pole. And the British guy, Scott, was like very well resourced. And Amundsen was not so well resourced, and he had to be kind of scrappy, but his approach was basically more efficient. And I won't tell everybody the whole story. You can go look it up. But he won. Amundsen from Norway won significantly, not just in time, but in not having so many people die and not suffering. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned there. But yeah, resources, because so many times I just hear people saying the problem is we don't have resources. And I think there's always a fix to that, to me. Like I have never met a nonprofit where the resource problem wasn't fixable.
Yeah, and look at, like, as I was researching stories of like the American Civil Rights Movement or the women's suffrage movement, were not funded by foundations. They were challenging the power structure and the status quo, so they were not getting big grants. And think of how successful they ultimately were, right? Through crowdsourcing and, pennies and dimes donated from people who were just super passionate. So, that you can change the world, with just an idea. And I find that very, very encouraging.
I love it. Well, Leah, before we sign off, because you're not just an author, you work with nonprofits actively. So what kinds of folks should reach out to you, and what's the best way for them to do that?
Definitely. Just visit my website, which is just my name. It's leahkral.com. And I'm also super active on social media and LinkedIn. There's a great community of nonprofiteers on LinkedIn. I love engaging with questions there. But my book, it's available at all major retailers. And the types of folks I work with are generally, busy nonprofiteers wearing many hats, whether it's, a board member, executive director, or a program manager, or, also social impact folks. So just anyone who's trying to solve social problems, you're definitely my crowd.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And thank you out there for listening and all that you do to make our world a better place. Before you sign off completely, if you could do me a favor and share this episode or any of the other episodes you found helpful with a colleague or friend, it will help them. It will help the larger community as well find this podcast. Until next time, all the best.
You've been listening to Inspired Nonprofit Leadership. Thanks so much for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode or the bonus episodes. And while you're at it, please leave a rating and review, and be sure to share with your friends and colleagues. Tune in every week for more useful insights and wisdom on nonprofit leadership. Thanks so much for all you do for the communities you serve. Until next time, all the best.